Right on. I'm a recovered alcoholic. My name's Tony.
Tony.
I know you guys are all excited to get started on the 4 steps, so I'll start a minute early here. I see you chomping away at the bit. Anyways, I'm a recovered alcoholic. My name's Tony. How we open this meeting is with the 3rd step prayer. What's the first requirement in making this thing work? God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always.
Amen.
Like I said, recovered alcoholic. My name's Tony. Sobriety date's April 8th, 1989. This is my service meeting. Tuesday, Fridays, and Wednesdays in Langley. Home groups, the Whale group, Saturday. In Langley, if you ever show up there, it's a good transition meeting. A lot of new people. Get to disturb a lot of people there on a constant basis. I really enjoy that meeting. We're on the 4th step. Probably, most of the steps are really misunderstood unless you're going kind of through the basic text and kind of understand why you're doing it. A lot of people don't know why they're doing a 4th step. And a lot of people start doing a behavior modification or immoral inventory, or they don't know why they're doing it. A lot of people do the inventory like it's to find things that they need to work on. Anybody ever hear that? Do a 4th step. These are the things I need to work on. Right? That's not the purpose of the 4th step, because if you were able to work on them, then you wouldn't need to do a 4th step. Right? So when we went through this, by the time we got to we agnostics, you were able to diagnose yourself what kind of alcoholic you were, right? By the time we got to page 44, you had a clear understanding of what alcoholism is and isn't. Then you know what type of alcoholic you are. A lot of people in the fellowship don't know what type of alcoholic they are. Right? A lot of people may have drinking problems, but what type of alcoholic you are. So if I was to do a survey now, would you be able to say what type of alcoholic you are? A lot of people say, don't ask me. Look away, right? I know what type I am by the result of the course of action taken before this. So before that, I had no idea. So you hear a lot of people say, I did step 1 before I got here. It's kind of impossible to do unless you know what alcoholism is, because what you're doing is conceding and admitting to having this problem. That in itself is not enough to fix it. If knowing you had a problem was enough to fix it, how many people would need to come to AA to find out what's going on? How many people has relapsed here? Right? And so a lot of people say, I've never relapsed. Then you wouldn't come to AA, because you come to AA is because why can't I stop drinking? Right? That's the question. How many people wanted to know that? How many people made a promise never to drink again? And you would have passed the lie detector's test. And how many people drank again? So there's something more to this, right? How many people are hoping this was a behavioral modification course? Just be a nicer person. I still wouldn't be sober. There's so much more to this. I thought that's what it was, because a lot of people I tried sobering up with gave me the impression that you work on yourself, you try to become a better person, and I don't know, anybody ever try that approach? Open doors for people, smile, be nice, do something kind every day, join a church, get in the choir, get hooked up with somebody in the choir, get drunk. No, I'm just I've tried every known means to get sober before actually doing this course of action. So in the 5th step, they talk about people have turned to easier methods, right? And invariably they get drunk again. So a lot of us, I've done 4 steps according to other people in the past before doing this process, and it's led to misery and depression. I used to do that life story inventory. Anybody ever do that life story inventory? My God, is that depressing? Because you're not saying anything that you don't already know. You're just reconfirming what you already know. Right? And you're putting it on paper, and you're the one dealing with it, which is the problem. When you're going through this process on your own power, you're left with who? Yourself. And when you open up a can of worms, anybody ever go digging in their past? And once you're in there, you find it really hard to get out? Causes that depression because you're going in alone. That's the difference between this process and other processes. So I've had people very interested in my life since junior kindergarten. Like I got these report cards I was showing Eddie. I'm very interested in Tony's development. We look with great interest. If he could learn to communicate without using his fist, that'd be great. If he could realize other people in the class are entitled to their opinion, right? So it started off at a really young age. Was I alcoholic? I don't know. But man, I was getting ready for a drink. When I took a drink, it was kind of like fantastic. So, and there's always been alcohol in my life, right? So a lot of people go, oh, when was the first time you drank? You ever hear that? It's not the first time you drank is where alcoholism starts. It's the first time it starts causing you problems and you can't correct or stop. That's where alcoholism is. Like I'm allergic to pistachios. The first time I ate pistachios, I didn't have no reaction to them. And as the years went on, I started having some reaction to it, but I didn't know what it was. I put it off as something else. And then I had a severe reaction where I ended up in hospital. And so when the nurse was hooked up to IV and all that stuff in emergency, and then they were explaining my situation, how well do you think I listened to that nurse as she explained my condition? I was watching her lips move. I was in emergency. There was chaos all around me. I never heard nothing but her explaining my problem. And by the time she finished explaining it, she explained it in such a way that I went and I bought 2 EpiPens. One to travel with me and one that goes in my luggage. Like I always have EpiPens. And then as time went on, it's kind of like I just don't eat pistachios. And I've never had a desire or an inkling to eat them. If I kept on eating them, would there be a problem more than the fact that I'm allergic to it? Yes. If I ended up in emergency more than 2 times and I talked to that same nurse, right? And she says, didn't I explain to you the last time you were here? And I said, yeah, but I thought if I had it in ice cream, it'd be different.
Yeah.
Right? How well do you think she would look at me? She'd go, so the 3rd time, would she ask me to see a dietitian or a psychiatrist? Because there's something going on here. Like there's something more than I'm able to comprehend here. There's something more at work. And that's kind of like alcoholism. How many people have been told here that you may have a problem? And how many people thought they had a problem for even mentioning it to you that you may have a problem? Because you never seen a problem with it, right? It was still kind of manageable. You could live with the consequences. Anybody here? Relocate, get new friends, change jobs, change careers, change apartments. Because as your alcoholism takes off, you got to downsize. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. It's all about downsizing, right? Because you can't change the way you drink, so you got to change your environment to accommodate your drinking. Anybody have that story here? Anybody sit with a drink in their hand wondering what's the matter with their life? Yeah. Waiter, what are you doing? I'm contemplating. There's something seriously wrong with my life. How many people has meditated over a drink here? Trying to figure out what's the matter with their life. So when we go through here, by the time you get to We Agnostics, you know exactly what's going on, because the preceding chapters are designed to inform you what alcoholism is and what alcoholism isn't, right? And by the time you get here, you kind of be armed with the facts about alcoholism and maybe about yourself. And then you discover how many symptoms are there in alcoholism? 2. But a lot of people give you the impression there's 3, right? And if they would have started with the 3rd, we find out when we get into working with how it works. They talk about we get spiritually sick as the result of our alcoholism. Our spiritual condition didn't create alcoholism. It was the solution to our problem. How many people took a drink here and really had no more problems? I don't know if it took away the problems, but you just didn't care anymore, right? Just like, and Bill talked about that, right? People were jumping to their death, and what did Bill do? He went back to the bar. How many people use that as a solution, right? And then when the consequences get to a place where you can't even live with them, then there's a problem, right? But you're usually the last one to know what that problem is. Everybody else already knows. And then when you find out what alcoholism is, you realize alcoholism has been happening for quite a while now, not just by the time you decided to do something about it. That's why we admitted that we have these symptoms. It's been ongoing. It's been present. It's been the conditioning factor to have you coming to AA or having your life look the way it is. So abstinence. How many people has tried abstinence here? Why doesn't abstinence work? Because we're dealing with an illness, right? And we can't see, feel, and touch it, because if you could see, feel, and touch it, then you could do something about it when it's happening. Anybody I'll watch out for it. That's what it says in step 2, right? Came to believe that your self-awareness will stop you from picking up in the future. How many people are hoping that's what step 2 said? I learned my lesson. Anybody learned their lesson more than once here? And then we really mean it about the 5th time. The first 4 times I was lying, right? So I got 11 years of in and out. My last relapse, I went to 360 meetings in 90 days. I was in 4 12 and 12 studies. My birthday was April 6th. I turned 27. It was in 1989. And that's 11 years. My first meeting was 11 years prior to that. So 1976 was my first meeting in AA. So 11 years later would be, 1989, right? So in that 11 years, I had no idea what I was dealing with, and it took a couple people to con me into a big book study and took me through this. I was so ill, I didn't even see the benefits of doing this. Once they've taken me through this and showed me the recipe, I've never drank since through the application. I've never met anybody who's ever done this process who hasn't had the experience who's ever relapsed. Not one person in the last 30 years, including me, which I'm of the hopeless variety. I'm the alcoholic of the hopeless variety. I'm beyond human aid. I cannot see, feel, and touch. I don't even know when I'll pick up a drink again. And that's been my story. So April 6th, I stayed sober. It was a Thursday. April 7th was a Friday, and I went to the meeting, talked about what a great job I did. On April 6th, April 8th was a Saturday. I got a 3-month chip, and I talked like I was getting an Academy Award. Anybody talk like that here? I like to thank me, and I like to thank me, and I like to thank me. Oh, and the people around me. But it was all self-based recovery, right? And I had all the slogans, I had all the catchphrases, I had all the bumper sticker. I had formulated a talk by being around here because I'm a bit of a chameleon. Any chameleons around here? You hear something really good at one meeting, and you're sharing it at another meeting. As long as nobody asks you what it means, you're usually okay, right? So George started asking me what this stuff meant. So by the time I got qualified to do this and I went through this, and by the time I got to step 3, I understood what this process was about. So when we get to page 60, it talks about being convinced we're at step 3. And then they go through the human condition here, which is my problem. I suffer from the human condition coupled with alcoholism, right? What's making my decisions before the spiritual experience is what?
Alcoholism.
Alcoholism coupled with my human condition. It's kind of neck and neck. So in order to take care of the alcohol condition, what condition needs to be resolved? My human condition, right? That's why they say we have a spiritual solution to your problem. And then they find out we have a spiritual malady. It's really hard to pinpoint. It exhibits itself in a lot of different ways. So when you look at page 62, they talk about this human condition, this malady, this angst, this thing that drives human beings. Not just alcoholics, but human beings. And here's the quality of the highlight of our assets when we come in here. You want to read that? Selfish, self-centered?
Alcoholic Ivana? Selfish self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us seemingly without provocation, but we invariably find that at some time in the past we have made decisions based on self that later placed us in a position to be hurt.
So they understand that because they went through a process, those that wrote this thing. As a new person, when George asked me that, why are you mad at these people? How come this keeps on happening? I wasn't able to tell him why. He says, why are you mad at these people? Because they're a-holes, they're this, they're that, they've done this. He says, no, why are you mad at them? Why are you so affected by these people? I didn't understand what he was talking about because I only had my understanding of this stuff. Like, I was pretty warped. My thinking was pretty warped based on me through my whole life. I remember sitting in a 12 and 12 study, a step 8, and I was probably at this time 10 years in and out. This is when I met my now sponsor, Alex. And there was Chuck Damon and all these guys, and they were talking about step 8 and a list they made from the people they hurt through their conduct. And then when it came to me, I said, I never did nothing to nobody that didn't have it coming to them. And the only list I got is the people to get even with. How many people think like that here? So a few of you are putting your hands up, and the rest of you are kind of not participating, right? It's not entrapment. There will not be a thing, right? So my thinking's warped in how I see things. And you couldn't tell me different based on my upbringing, based where I come from, based on my survival skills, based on everything that formulated me. That was my best thinking. So if you're driven by 100 forms of fear and self-delusion, what two thoughts do you want to go with? So you really can't trust your own process, right? How many people have been left in confusion or problem in relationships with people, places, and things, wondering how you get there and wondering what their problem is? How many people spent a lot of time wondering what their problem is? How many people spend a lot of time that life's picking on you? How many people, the ultimate one is you get to a place that total of demoralization, incomprehensible demoralization, and you think God's doing it to you. How many people have the ultimate God card? Look what God's doing to me. Yes, look what God's doing to you. If God was doing to you, you'd look a lot worse than you are. So our inability to see the truth about us, right? So they go through, so our troubles.
So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot.
So we kind of read that. We're an extreme example of the human condition, right? People think like us, but normal people are people who are functioning at some level. Somewhere in their thinking, they say, this thinking isn't working for me, and stop thinking it. We don't stop thinking it. We're still thinking of it at the bottom of a bottle. Anybody still drinking, thinking about what those people that are carrying that resentment, nothing? Normal people don't do that, right? Because they're not coupled with alcoholism, they're able to change their thinking. So what I mean by that is my wife one day, I said, man, I was telling her how we think. She goes, I think like that, which kind of made me nervous. And she said, well, wait a minute. She says, the difference between me and you is I don't find myself at the bottom of a bottle still thinking it's true. So you had to go there, right? So we're fundamentally different, my wife and I, in a lot of areas. How I'm driven by certain things where she's not driven by these things. But she has the human condition. So do I. But what happens with me is I don't know where reality starts and where it stops. I formulate ideas that I believe to be true, and you can't tell me different. Anybody like that here? Yep. And then after apologizing for those thoughts that you thought were true, and so we see this cycle, eh? And so they arise out of ourselves. Where's this other place that says, on page 54, they talk about, we won't go there, but they talk about, on these things, the fabric of which our lives were constructed, our thinking, our feelings, and our emotions. All our life experience that has us responding to life today, right? So all of us have different experiences that have us here. But the basis of it is being driven by thoughts and ideas and emotions. How many people have certain emotions and thoughts and ideas that they can't shake when they're in it? That are consumed by it. And then one thought starts another thought that starts another thought, and then you start involving the people around you. You ever notice when you become a little irritable and discontent that the people around you are just so thrilled with your demeanor? Yeah. Anybody still go home, put the key in the door, and there's a hesitation on the inside of the door to see what kind of emotional condition you're in? Oh, yeah, a couple of me, yeah. So the promises aren't coming true for these people around you, but every meeting you go to, they're all coming true, right? Anyways, so they arise out of ourselves. I don't know what they are yet. So on page 62, they talk about the inability to shake self, or the self-centeredness, or the focus on ourselves. And then they talk about this idea that these spiritual principles, God, the Father, whatever you want to call the principle, the agent, we become. This idea was possible through going through this course of action. Is it extremely hot in here?
Yeah. Should open the door to there.
It is cooking in here.
It's hot.
So, sometimes there's a guy that has a resentment against this big book. He turns on the heat. Those big book people, right? The new guy. Turn the heat up. Okay. So then, on page 63, we see that they're talking about a new experience as the result of this course of action. And then we see that they talk about we are now at step 3, right? And they give us an idea here, right? if it was possible to achieve this here, then you wouldn't need to do the rest of the steps. Step 3 is an idea of the possibility of obtaining these experiences through going through this course of action, right? In order to experience the step 3 kind of dialogue or the outlay or the summary, because it's a summary of the course of action, right? So by the time I finish the course of action, I'll comprehend what they're talking about in step 3 here. And so we make this decision to do what?
Go through the rest of the
Turn our
work.
will and our eyes over
To the care of God. And so what's God's will for us at this point in time?
Go through the work.
Do the rest of the work.
Do the rest of the work. Because if you're, a lot of people are mistaken. I said, I give my will to God. It doesn't say to the care of. So if you gave somebody something to look after, hey, can you take care of this for me while I'm away? Would you expect it back when you come back from vacation?
Yeah.
That's kind of like this. So the best analogy I've ever heard was somebody says, you put your will in an envelope, you hand it over to God, and then by step 10, you get the envelope back. Right? You get it back. So what I'm trusting this process is to create this change that I agreed that I need in step 2. And what did I agree that I need in step 2?
Spiritual experience.
Or a psychic change, spiritual experience. We found out what that meant in the back of the appendix. Because if I don't obtain this thing, what's my fate?
Drink again.
I'm going to drink again. So it says it's a recipe to remove alcoholism from my human condition. Doesn't mean I'm not alcoholic anymore. It just means I'm not suffering from alcoholism, and I can start treating the human condition, which is 2 different things, because I can't treat alcoholism on my own. I need to go through this process. So then what confirms that I've started step 3 or done step 3?
You start step 4.
I start step 4. So if you haven't started step 4, you haven't done step 3 yet. That's why they say the wording's quite optional, so long as we express the idea. The idea of what? That I'm hoping to experience these things that they're talking about, right? So then we go over to the next page and we find out on page 64, alcohol is but a symptom. We've kind of covered this in great detail. And then we talk about, therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. This was step 4, and what they're saying is, we're going to give you a new recipe on how to look at life, because the way you look at life isn't working for you. There's a mechanism in your brain that can't see these things that other people are able to see. So we need to reformulate how you look at things so you can start applying these spiritual principles different to get relief from it. But first you need to be honest about the stock and trade. You need to see it differently. And then so they talk about here, we did exactly the same thing with our lives. You want to hit us up with that?
Yeah, we did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure, being convinced that self, manifested in various ways, was what had defeated us. We considered it its common manifestation.
So remember before, driven by 100 forms of fear, right, and self-delusion, 100 forms. So they're saying, here, we're going to hit some of the basic ones that are causing you your most problems. And if you could learn how to formulate these principles in these areas, then you could address any problem you have. Because it all stems from the same place. But you need to learn a recipe on being able to acknowledge these things on a different level. Not an intellectual level, but a conscious level. That in step 11, you'll intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle you. It becomes a working part of the mind. You're more in touch with your consciousness through meditation. You're able to deal with things as they come up. But right now, it's almost impossible because you're driven by all these things that you carry. As long as you're carrying all these things, how effective are you going to be in today? Because these things are happening at a subconscious level. You don't even know they're eating your lunch for you. But when they come up, how many people has been plagued with depression and self-pity? You just find yourself in it. That's not today's stuff. That's stuff you're still carrying. That's like if you put an outhouse in your basement, you're going to have a little stink in your living room, aren't you? When you sit in your living room and go, what the hell is that? But you're not too sure what it is because somebody put an outhouse in the basement. But you don't know the effect of it. You're kind of like, what the hell? And that's kind of like the 4th step. We need to get the outhouse outside so you can enjoy your living room. Does that kind of make more sense? A lot of us have been sitting in this stuff for way too long. We're used to the smell. People come over and visit, go, what the hell? You go, what? No, sir. Anybody ever visit somebody who lived by a railroad tracks? or an airport?
Yeah.
They get used to everything. I used to live by the airport, the jumbo landing, and everything's shaking in the house, and you're sitting there like nothing's happening. You're just used to the sound. So imagine being a CN railway on one side and the airport on the other side. Anybody visiting you would be really uncomfortable with what's happening. And that's everybody around you. They're very uncomfortable with what's happening with you. Anybody still very uncomfortable with what's happening with you and still have issues with you and still on high alert when you show up? Anybody phone people and there's a long pause? Hello? Anybody still having people not answering the phone? But anyways, we'll leave it alone. So we're going to look at the common manifestations. Okay, that means these are the main things that eat our lunch for us and will cause us our greatest problems and greatest handicaps. Unless we find a way of having these things removed or find peace with them, we'll continue to relapse. Right? So, resentment.
Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stems all forms of spiritual disease.
So we hear a lot of people say, oh, I have a spiritual disease. No, from the resentment. From it stems all forms of spiritual disease. So this is like the abscess on our spirit, on our soul, on our consciousness. It's an abscess that's sitting there, right? That's what's causing the problem, is the abscess on our spirit. From it stems all forms of spiritual disease. Does that kind of make sense? As long as that abscess is there, how well are we going to function? We're not, because it's poisoning ourselves, right? So that's what. So the resentment is causing the abscess. From it stems all forms of spiritual disease, right? From what? From the resentment. Okay.
For we have not only been mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically.
So they use the word malady again, as they did in regards to the second symptom of alcoholism on page 23 that centers in our mind. It's really hard. They're trying to describe it in the best way they know how, but it's really hard to really kind of describe it. So they give you, this is what it looks like. Right, here's the areas what it looks like, because it's really hard to pinpoint. It's something that I've never been able to really go to myself, how do you feel? Oh, I think I have a spiritual malady happening. It has to be connected to something in order to see it. So when we're spiritually right, everything's right. When we're not spiritually right, nothing's right. It's like they used to have this saying, no peace. The way it was spelt was N-O-K-N-O-W, no peace, right? And then no peace, whatever. No God, no peace, something like that, right? And it was spelled N-O. Just the changing of the words. No peace, no God. No God, no peace.
Yeah, that's it.
Right? I know you're supposed to help me out there. I was trying
to figure it out myself.
I seen everybody going, what the hell? I'm going to say about it.
English is confusing.
Yeah, English is very confusing. Okay, so they're saying when the spiritual maladies, this thing inside, when all these things are removed from my consciousness, all these abscesses that I carry, carry emotions and ties to my past that are interfering with today, when these things are removed, how well do you think I'll live in today? Really good. So they're saying we're going to give you the recipe, but let's start going through this. So when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. So we see that this change happened, the psychic change of spiritual experience. And I think when they talk about physically is emotionally here, because most people try to deal with their emotions. If you're mentally not right, how is your emotions going to be? Yeah, not right. And if you're being driven by all the things you're still carrying, how are you going to be mentally, emotionally? So subconsciously, these things will determine how you think and how you feel. Does that kind of make sense? Okay.
In dealing with resentments, we set them on paper. We list people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry.
So we made a list. And this is the start of meditation. They're teaching they don't tell you this, but it's actually the start of learning how to meditate. You do the third step prayer, you sit quietly, and you just make a list. How many people found it almost impossible to make a list? So you're being an observer how you function or how you operate with basic information that's going to save your life and your resistance to it. Anybody get some names that they weren't going to put out? Anybody think of names that and then their other part of their brain says, You've already dealt with that. You don't need to put it down. How many people got that? I'm not mad at anybody. I've forgiven all those people. Well, write down all those people you've forgiven. Oh, there's a lot of them. You ever hear people talk about forgiveness 20 minutes later? Okay, we've gone through the list of everybody they forgive. Okay. So we got the list. And then what do we do with the list? We got these sheets here that you can go through. And so when we have the list, we put the name over on one column here, and then in the next column,
we asked ourselves why we were angry.
Anybody don't know why they're angry at these people? Oh, we know why. What they did. That's why, right? And so then the cause. Why are we angry? And then the third column is where the interesting stuff was, where it stems from.
In most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, our pocketbook, our ambitions, our personal relationships, I'm missing the page, were hurt or threatened, so we were sore. We were burnt up. On our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries. Was it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, our personal or sex relations, which had been interfered with?
And that's all these columns are. A lot of people think the exercise is writing a long documentary on it. It's not. It's to be aware of how self is created, or how these things are still inside your consciousness, are still eating your lunch for you. I don't know how else to say that. And where it stems from. So I get to see now why I'm mad at these people is because it's my self-esteem that was interfered with, or my personal relationship. One of my instincts were associated with this harm. Right? And it's kind of interesting. So now when George asked me, why are you mad at these people? I said, because they affected my self-esteem. They affected my personal relationship. They affected my material, my emotional, my acceptable sex, my hidden sex. And if you're working with a sponsor, they'll help you go through that. But and then my ambitions. So I get a good idea how self operates. This is where the unmanageability stems from. Right? And if I can't stay sober, is your life manageable? So that's where that our lives have become unmanageable. If I can't stay sober and I'm a prey to misery and depression, and I can't control my emotional nature, how successful in life am I going to be? Oh, well, periodically I get 2 months here, 3 months there, and any pyromaniacs here? Bring your own gas and matches to the party? Burn it down. Anybody burn their life down here more than once? Anybody quit a job and show them? And they're still operating. Okay. So we see, which is interesting, eh? Okay, then we go. Go ahead.
We went. Do you want me to sit down?
So we're usually as defined as this example. So we see this example is just transferred over to the sheets here. Right? We get a rough idea about the stock and trade, where this stuff comes from, what self is made out of. So we see self is made out of these instincts. Right? Now I see how I operate. Now it's kind of interesting, and this is what you'll use in step 10 and mostly in 11. When you're reconstructing your life, this is where they ask you in step 11, when you go through your day, what you could have done differently. And you see, based on one of your instincts, you had conflict with a person, place, or thing. And then on your review, what could we have done instead? You said, I see I'm having a problem here with my self-esteem. I don't go work on my self-esteem. I work on my spiritual condition. And when my spiritual condition resolves itself, I no longer have a problem with people, places, and things. So what I start seeing is when I'm instinct-based, right, I'm conflict-oriented. And when I'm spiritually based, I'm more in harmony with life around me, mostly myself. So what I get to see, what it looks like when I'm spiritually based or instinct-based. I'm one or the other, right? And when I'm instinct-based, this is what it looks like. I'm in conflict. When I'm running the show, this is what it looks like. Are we having fun yet? Let's put another name down. Okay, sorry. So we're usually as defined as this example. Mr. Brown, all the causes. Mr. Jones, all the causes. And we do that here. We don't fill in the first column with all the names. We put one name, all the causes. Point form, not a big story. Right? My mom, her boyfriends, her attention to my sister, like on and on and on. Does that kind of make sense? And 2 pages later, let's go to my dad. 6 pages later, let's go to my sister, which is difficult because in that conflict, I wouldn't put my sister down. on the list, and I thought about it for 2 days. And then once I put my sister on the list, 6 names followed. It unleashed a whole bunch of blockages from other areas. And it doesn't go in the area. A lot of people go, we'll go from age 5 to 6. No, you got to do it as your conscious releases it. So you could have something in junior kindergarten or before, and then something in high school. Is how it's released from inside of you, and then you kind of see how your attachment to it. Right? And as you're doing the prayers, as you start reliving the story, which is in the exercise, what do you do as you start feeling and reliving the story? Pray. So that means you interrupt, you step back from it, and say, this is not the purpose of the exercise. You remind yourself what the purpose of the exercise is, and do the third step prayer. As you do the third step prayer, you see how the bondage and the difficulties arise out of yourself, and the inability to have domain over your own thinking and your emotions, how driven you are by your own thinking and your own emotions, how you're a slave to you. Yay, having fun yet? Should we do the wave start on this side of the room? Go. Okay. So we turn back to the list.
We're at the bottom, right?
Oh, yeah.
We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. When we finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was that this world and its people often were quite wrong.
Thoroughly. So that means, like, if you've gone through treatment, they usually do 5 or 6 to give you some relief. Here's thoroughly. You need to get rid of all that stuff. It's just like a thorough cleaning. Not just the dishes you see, a thorough cleaning. There's a big difference between just doing what you can see and a thorough cleaning. Anybody hide their dishes under the sink? Anybody ever get to a point where they look at their sink, back when you're drinking, you look in the sink and there's like this much grease and you got to unplug it, put your hand in it to go unplug it? Use a fork. Okay, there we go. And that's kind of like us, and the stains on the, you look at it, it's so overwhelming that it's time to move. No. But here they're saying, we're going to show you how to compartmentalize it so it's manageable. Empty the sink, pile the dishes, right? Get clean. Like, they're going to show you how to make it manageable so that the end result is you have a clean apartment. Some of the stains will remain, but you work on them as time goes on. Right? And you're not the cleaner. You're just the applier of the cleaner. The cleaner is your relationship with a power greater than yourself. Anybody have some stains that just takes a lot of work? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got.
True or false?
True.
Oh, we like those people, eh?
The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse, and then we were sore at ourselves. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got.
So we see it shifts. After resentment, who do you turn on? You turn on yourself, right? So and that's the story of all of us. And when you turn on yourself, it's really bad. Like, you need to get, you can't be in depression and walking. You ever notice that? You got to sit down. And to really enjoy it, you got to kind of get horizontal, right? Okay, it takes work. Some of us really enjoy it.
In the dark.
Come on, in the dark. Here we go. Shut the phone off. Oh, no, leave the phone on. Make sure people are phoning you, seeing it. But don't answer it. And if something says phone, somebody said, no, I'm going to enjoy this moment. It's me time. And then if you really work it, you get to the place where you're at your own funeral. Crying.
Anybody
been there?
Bad for me.
Yeah, I feel so bad for me. Is there anybody else? Time to get in a relationship. I need help. No. Sorry. I had to go there. Okay, move on.
As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness.
So the problem is deep resentment. See, the problem is we can't see it, and a lot of it's really buried. Some of that stuff is behind closed doors. And it does come up every once in a while. You find yourself reliving something that way in the past, right? Like, I used to get this vision of me stuck. I was in the doorway as a kid, and I had no place to go, and I used to be an observer of me, and that loneliness I felt in that doorway. It was cold, and the snow on the ground. There's nobody in the house. Like, I remember sitting in between the screen door and the door, I was just a little kid, and I remember the pain and agony I had in that moment. I'm not too sure what was surrounding it, but when I revisit that in my mind, I was back there again. I was still that kid in that doorway, or other episodes of things happening to me, but then I'd rebury it, and it would be a year before it'd come up again, or 3 years. Anybody have that kind of story?
Yeah.
So what happens is we think we deal with it because we're not thinking about it. Or we think, I don't have that many resentments. Well, that's why we make the list. And if it comes to mind, write it down. And so by the time you get here, that deep resentment, as long as that stuff's present, are we going to reconstruct our lives? What's determining how we respond to people, places, and things is those things. Right? Those things are still talking us out of happiness today. How many people talk themselves out of happiness here? It's not you doing it. It's those things. It's those memories, those feelings of things that you can't see, feel, and touch that are saying, don't go that way. The pain, the agony, right? The connection, the dependence, the intimacy. Any people have problems with relationships there? It's usually connected to something in the past that you think is going to happen in the present, but your consciousness don't tie those two things together. And that's what this 4 steps starts to do, right? You start unlocking all these things and you kind of go, well, but the difference is you're not going through it alone. You're going through it and starting to see how this power is possible to create a change within your life. This is where you see this thing that don't make no sense. Prayer actually starts to work. It creates a shift within inside of you where you're able to be an observer of these things and step back from it emotionally. It's like having a stereo with surround sound that's too loud. The first thing this does is turn down the stereo so you're comfortable enough to watch the screen. And then as time goes on through practicing, there's no volume whatsoever. There's no emotional attachment to it. But some of that stuff will carry in your 6 and 7 and 11, and it might take years to get, but it's manageable if you use this recipe. Some of this stuff shifted. It took like 17 years for some of these grave emotional mental disorders, these attachments that I had, but they weren't determining my life for me. And then when they did start coming up to ruin the relationships that I was in, that's where sponsorship comes in, that's where the fellowship comes in, and that's where these ideas come in that you're able to work past those things, not the word sabotage, but you're not really knowing you're sabotaging it. What you're doing is talking yourself out of happiness. So you're able to get the right idea and move toward that, move past the pain, and it subsides for new experiences. Does that kind of make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave.
So people miss this part. Like first time I went through, my sponsor said, hold on a second, look at this. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might be worthwhile? I got a little offended by that. But then I started having to look at how much time did I spend in yesterday? How much time do I spend in the future? How much time do I spend with attachment to things of what might happen, or it's going to happen, or what did happen? How much time did I relive these feelings, these emotions, and these pains, these angst? How many times did I come to my awareness of living in a story that's already happened? Because when I come to of the awareness of the story, I'm already in the story. Anybody been there? And that's what they're to the precise extent that I permit these. So the recipe is starting to say now I acknowledge this is starting to happen, right? I'm the narrator of the story now. Instead of saying, now I got a channel changer, which is my relationship with a power greater than myself. I don't like what's on the screen or the volume it's playing on. I'm able to turn it down and change channels. So that means I stop, step back from it, pray, and change the channel. I shift my thinking to the recipe. And as time goes on, this thing stops having a hold on me. Doesn't mean I don't still have the experience of it. We'll see how our experience can benefit others. That means when I talk about my story, it doesn't create, and like for years I talk about my story and it bring up emotional pain, right? And like I'd still be stuck to the pain, but to unravel it, to stand back from it, and to be an observer of it is really a gift. There's probably one or two things in my life from my past that still, when it rises up, it'll trap me for a second, and I'll live it because I want to relive the whole thing. Anybody relive the whole thing? I know the story, but I want to stay in it because it has me locked in it. It has me hook, line, and sinker. So here, I start, instead of permitting it, I step back from it. I acknowledge what happened. I acknowledge I wish I could have done it differently, and I acknowledge I would correct it if I could. So where I correct it is within inside of me. I don't permit these things to happen anymore. I couldn't do it before because I didn't have the power to access change. Lack of power is our dilemma, to create the change within myself to have a new experience. They're saying here, I don't have to permit these things anymore. And if you do, you're the one allowing it to happen. Because you have a recipe now to create a change within inside of yourself, but you're stuck to your story. It's giving you some form of satisfaction or some form of, I hate to say it that way, but pain. We get used to pain because it's ours. Nobody can take it from you. You can nurture it, you can turn it. It's just mine. Go find a quiet place to sit down and really mold it. Get some Kleenex out and it's the same story. And believe me, I've had trauma beyond. I could spend the next 2 weeks talking about trauma here. I've been there, done that. There's freedom from it, and it's hard to believe that we can get freedom from it. But if you've dug a hole 15 feet deep, it's going to take you 15 feet up to get out of it. But it doesn't have to take you as many years to get out of it. I don't know how else to say that. So the best thing that this is they talk about here, I used to picture my soul as being a big tower, but it went into the ground. And as I went down the staircase, at the top it was well lit, and as I went down the staircase, as I started spinning around, it started getting darker and more blacker. The rock started getting more black, and the water was running off of it, and the mold was starting to build, and the smell was starting to happen. And in each one of these cells that were connected to, I would look in, but I was always looking out from the inside. Now I'm kind of opening up these doors, and inside the room's dark. And I used to find myself in that room. Now I bring a candle and I put it in that room. So each room within my past has a candle in it. I don't know how else to explain that. So I don't have to go live there anymore. It's no longer a dark place for me to go. I'm no longer entrapped by it. I have a freedom from it. But I had to go down those compartments within inside of myself to put that there. And that's what this is kind of saying, right? It gets really interesting here.
We found that it is fatal, for when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit.
Fatal, is that good? Fatal. This is serious stuff here. And so when we have these emotions that arise, this cyst that arise, it shuts us off from the sunlight of the Spirit. So we're not always disconnected, but this emotion, this memory, this pain, this agony, this trauma separates us from ourselves. Now we become instinct-based. Does that kind of make sense? When you're in that, how many people feel anxiety? The fight or flight, the breathing, everything starts to shift and there's nothing happening. There's nothing happening. What happened was back then. What you're doing is reliving, refeeling, resentment, carrying. How many people are here right now? How many people started thinking about different things within their own life? That's what the fourth step is about. See, your consciousness goes here. Here's another thing. Here's another thing. Here's another thing. It's all there, right? This process says that doesn't have to be your story anymore. We're going to create a new story for you. Doesn't mean we disregard the old story, but we change the story that we can find peace with it. You'll know a new freedom and a new happiness. That's the whole point of this. How many people would like a new freedom and a new happiness from their past? How many people would like their past stopping eating their lunch for them? That's what this is about.
The insanity of alcohol returns and we drink again.
Not the obsession, the insanity. If you don't deal with the shit that's eating your lunch, you will drink again.
And with us...
Or kill yourself.
Yeah.
How many people sat there and thought, I ain't going on like this. Right? There's freedom from that. Like, that's kind of, right? There's actual freedom from that. Believe me, okay, we'll go on.
And with us, to drink is to die. If we were to live, we had to be free of anger.
How many people like to be free of it? So they're going to they're giving us the recipe to do that. But you need to know the recipe. In order to do that, you need to do this. Writing your life story won't do it. Writing 4 or 5 resentments won't do it. You need a house cleaning. You need to clean the abscesses that are still connected to your experience.
The grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men, but for the alcoholic, these things are poison.
So, when they say the grouch and the brainstorm, they don't mean good ideas. We're brainstorming, that's not that kind of brainstorm. The brainstorm. You know what a brainstorm is? Think about that. The brainstorm. Storm within your brain. And it's not a little wind blowing through the front door. Oh, open the door. Isn't that nice? It's not one of those. Anybody ever see The Wizard of Oz here? Yeah. Lift the whole house up. And, hey, there's us on the bike. A storm. I mean, it's a chaos. We're bombarded by thoughts and ideas. Anybody get sideswiped by some of their emotions, their ideas, and their past, crippled by that stuff? Brainstorm. Once you open the door, it's kind of like the shutter. Once the shutters are open, it's kind of like knock you on your ass kind of stuff. Anybody have that stuff going on? So we're not alone in that. It's the common experience of all of us. It's the human condition that's crippling us, right? So we need a new experience from that stuff, right?
We turned back to the list, for it held the key to the future. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle.
So most things we look at is from left to right. On the sheets, we're going to look at it from right to left. Entirely different angle. We're going to see how we started setting the ball rolling based on our instincts. And where they talk about in the 4th column here is where we had been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, or inconsiderate. Most of the things that occurred in my life, 98% of them, I created. Based on one of those things, based on my instincts. The things that continue to happen in my life after the first time it happened, I still created it. Out of fear, out of conditioning, out of whatever. The inability, like where I grew up and the things that happened, the things that continue to happen, I didn't have any other, it was fear. That was the basis of my life. And so what kept on creating these things was fear. Fear of not telling somebody, the fear of not involving somebody, the fear of it will be worse if I let people know. So it was hard kind of thing. So what created these things to happen was fear. It arose out of myself to stop me from correcting it. And I kind of went, yeah, it didn't mean to beat myself up. That means that was the best I can do for what happened back then. That's my story back then. Would it be different today? 100%. If I was the same person today and I was back there living that stuff, it would be different. I'd have a different story based on who I am today. Because I wouldn't have continued to be in those situations or allow those things to happen or to put myself in those situations. Because of my self-esteem, my ambitions, my security. One of these things led me to those people, places, and things. Kind of it's really a hard egg to swallow, right? Okay, but it's freeing.
Yes, it is. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill.
Fancied or real, that means when they say the list, if that's the way you see it, put it down. Because I was thinking, did that actually happen or did that didn't happen? Because I have a lot of my story I don't really remember. People told me. I've come to in situations kind of, oh, this ain't good. And then go back in old blackout. Like I have a lot of stories where I woke up in places going, whoa, this ain't good. Thank God I went into another blackout. How many people got those stories where you wake up in situations or places with people, places, and things, you go, oh my God, I'm going back to AA.
Take another drink.
Take another drink. I got 11 years of that. Okay.
How could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how?
So you're not going to be without resentments. As long as you have the human condition and you're thinking, you're going to be prone to resentments. So now you need to find a way to escape these resentments. But how? Right? Isn't that a good question?
How?
How many people like to know how to escape and master resentments?
We could not wish them away any more than alcohol.
How many people let it go, ignore it? Acceptance. That doesn't work for people like us. You need to deal with all this stuff before you can find acceptance. If acceptance worked, wouldn't that be nice? Just bypass the steps and go right to acceptance. Another form of self-delusion, right? Driven by 100 forms of self-delusion. How many people like that? I don't need to do that card. I'm feeling so much better now. Again, welcome back. Again, right? So we're escape artists. Any escape artists here? That's why we can't trust ourselves to really gauge ourselves. That's why when we go through this process, we have things to see if it's actually true what's happening or not true what's happening. Did I formulate this delusion of things have changed or things have actually changed? Am I trying to convince everybody around me things have changed? Or have they changed? I need an ability to be able to assess myself based on what's happening inside of me, not around me. Because we're chameleons. Anybody think they have everybody around them fooled? And then when you're left alone, you're not so fooled? When you're alone with yourself, this is where you know whether you actually have a new freedom and a new happiness. When the lights go out and you're alone or you're sitting alone in your own thoughts, can you sit comfortably within your own being for periods of time? Or do you need to have a constant distraction from you? And that's what they're saying here. I need to escape. I need to find a new way of processing life. I need to find a new way to find peace within myself without causing me more pain. Because we are escape. Anybody got a list of things that make them feel better? That make you feel worse? Anybody doing things that they don't want to do? And not doing things that they want to do? Lack of power. That's what they're saying here. They're saying it's these internal things that are doing it. So I need to learn how to master resentment.
This was our course.
This was our
course. We realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way they disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, "This is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God, save me from being angry. Thy will be done."
So where is this happening? Where's this recipe happening? They just gave us a recipe.
In prayer.
Inside my thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when these things start happening, I'm starting to look at these people differently. I need to look at them differently. Because I see how I operate under self-will or my instincts and the harms I've created people. What I've done to people based on me. And it wasn't personal, the things I did. I couldn't have done it any other way because of my instincts. Now I see they, like myself, were instinct-based or spiritually sick. They couldn't help doing what they did. So my mom, my dad, and people, it wasn't personal. The things I did to people wasn't personal, well, somewhere, but based on my lifestyle. That's a whole different story. But the whole idea is that I see I couldn't help but do those things. I couldn't help conduct myself in that manner because I didn't have the power to have a different experience. I was driven by these things. And same with these people, places, and things. They couldn't have done it any different. And I was just collateral damage in their lives. Just like the people were in my lives. So when my mom's situation come up, or my dad's situation come up, or that club situation come up, or this situation come up, I'm able to step back from it and look at them differently. And pray that prayer to correct it in my mind. So as I start correcting my attachment to these people, places, things in my mind, I start getting separation from it. I start looking at them differently. It didn't mean what they did was okay. It meant I started getting freedom from it because I started to see it wasn't personal. Anybody in that situation and any one of those things of my past would have had the same experience. It wasn't personal, even though it felt personal. anybody in that same situation would have had the same outcome and the same experience. Right? So when I see Bob, right, Uncle Bob, I see it wasn't just me. I'm just using it in kind of general way. It could have been anybody. If Uncle Bob was somebody else's uncle or somebody else, right? Anybody in that situation would have got the same treatment or the same deceit or the same experience. Does that kind of make sense? When I ended up in that wrong place at the wrong time by how I placed myself there and what happened, anybody in that same situation would have got the same thing. Didn't mean I have to like it. Just means I start correcting it within inside of myself, and I start applying the prayer. So that's the resentment prayer of the people, places, and things of the shift that ain't happening yet. So 90% of my 4, a lot of the shift will happen. For the other stuff that we still cling on to or still has that cyst or that pain attached to it, we start chopping away at the tie to it like a big root system. Imagine every time you step back and you take an axe and you chop it like a big rope holding a ship, right? The ship's meant to be in the sea and kind of the experience. But if it's still anchored and it can't get away from the shore, it's not living the way or designed to be what it's supposed to be. So imagine chopping that thing every time it comes up. You chop, and pretty soon you have the freedom from it. Awesome. And this is part 1. Next week we'll do part 2. What's the most important part of the 4th step? The prayer. Prayer, accessing that power where it creates change within inside of yourself. The experience of this change that starts happening within inside of yourself. On Tuesday nights, we close with a great meditative prayer as suggested in step 11. We close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. We have the worksheets for those who want to get involved. If you need extra help, Tuesdays and Fridays at 6 o'clock, we meet in this room. Okay, I'm a recovered alcoholic. My name's Tony. Sobriety date's April 8th, 1989. How we open this meetings with the Serenity Prayer.
All right.
What do we need for a good meeting? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. How many people is looking like for a new experience in their lives? Well, it's kind of like a new experience. How many people came here hoping they'd find a solution to a problem they weren't too sure of? How many people are looking forward to their past being their future? Okay, so we all agree on that one, right? There's certain mechanics that happen in the basic text that a lot of people are really unfamiliar with. And there's so much hype on this side of it that people are really, really cautious going into it because they don't understand the mechanics of it. When you understand the mechanics of it and the purpose of it, it makes a lot more sense. All the way from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 and all the way through this process. We use the basic text put together by the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous that outlines the program of recovery that we hear and how it works. How many people has heard how it works here? How many people would like to explain it? Okay, so, right? So we listen to something all the time, we go, oh yeah, and then we try to formulate our own ideas what it means. Anybody ever do that? How many people come here, look at the wall, and try to figure out what they meant by their statements? Yeah. There's 2 different statements, what you're doing. So if you were talking to them, they would be talking from a place of experience, and you'd be talking from a place of learning, right? And if you're alcoholic, you would already know what they're talking about before you even... Anybody already know everything here? Anybody like topic meetings here? Let's talk in great lengths about stuff I have no idea about. So this is kind of weird, but if you're not at the 4, it's okay, right? We're going to hit some highlights of the 4, so when you're at it, you'll see the purpose of it. You'll understand why you kind of need to do it and the mechanics of it. Because the mechanics of 4 allows you to do 10 and 11. but mostly 11, right? We hear so many different ideas on how to do this, but that's not really backed up in our literature. We have a lot of other people's influences and ideas coming into the fellowship of AA, and it sounds good, so people adopt that idea as being the program of recovery, and it isn't. Anybody ever relapse here? So you missed something the first time, right? But we thought, how many people thought they did good? I got 3 months before. Well, if you're looking for 3 months again, continue to do what you were doing. Right? What they say here is they have a solution when applied to your life will remove the illness of alcoholism from your life. You're still an alcoholic, but you're no longer suffering from alcoholism. And once you're no longer suffering from alcoholism, then you could deal with the real problem. Anybody know what the real problem is once you remove alcohol?
Ourselves.
Yeah, I had Milton gave me this little sticker. I'd never caught it at first. He says, go home and put this on the mirror. So I went home and I put it on the mirror. It took me about a week before I caught on to it. It says, you are now looking at the problem. I thought it was for my girlfriend. Later I found out it was for me. Okay, so what is the purpose of step one when we go through the process in the book? So when we get to We Agnostics, it's a summary of a highlight of everything we've done. We have the worksheets back there that takes you through the format of the book. And so one of the things that's really interesting about the book is when they start a new chapter, they'll tell you what the previous chapter was for. It's like when you get to more about alcoholism, what do you think they'll be talking about there? More about alcoholism. So they're under the impression you already have the basic understanding of alcoholism. How many symptoms are there in alcoholism? Two. There are 2 symptoms. A lot of people like to add to that. Yes, there may be other problems, but there's only 2 symptoms in alcoholism. So when we get to We Agnostics, they kind of cover what they are, right? And they also tell you what the preceding chapters were for, right? And so by the time you get here, you've gone through the doctor's opinion, you've gone through the forwards. Hopefully you have a sponsor that's taking you through this, or you go through the worksheets to get the basic fundamental idea of what the problem is, what the solution is, and what the course of action is from whose understanding? From their understanding. So by the time you get here, all the information you have acquired is from them. And now is the first time they really ask you to diagnose yourself, right? So we find out what the preceding chapters are for. You want to lay us on, everybody on page 44?
Sure. Catherine, alcoholic? In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic.
Have they done that?
Yes.
So by the time you've gone through all those chapters, you'll know what type of alcoholic you are. So if I walked around and asked everybody individually what type of alcoholic you are, would you be able to say, I'm this type or that type? Or most people wouldn't know what that is. And I mean that in the most, I had George ask me that. I was 11 years in and out, and he asked me what an alcoholic was. And I wasn't able to tell him what alcoholism was. I told him all the behaviors associated with alcoholism or being too drunk, the fighting, the jails, the institution, the car wrecks, the marriages, the relationships. He says, none of that makes you an alcoholic. It makes you an asshole, but it doesn't make you an alcoholic. I don't like George, but he's my sponsor. You're not supposed to like him, right? Like my sponsor's job was to disturb me on a constant basis, right? And he did a really good job, right? And Chuck used to say, he'd hear me at a meeting, he says, oh, that sounded great. He says, can you show me where it says that? So when you're sharing at a meeting, and if somebody was come up to you and say, hey, can you show me everything you're talking about in here? Can you show me that? Would you be able to show them what you're talking about? Most people can't because they formulated a talk based on what they heard at other meetings. So they've accumulated ideas that make sense to them that they start sharing at other meetings. So what they're really sharing is other people's experience, hoping it's their own. Right? And we're that type of people. When we talk about something long enough, we actually think it's true. I don't know, anybody like that here? And then when we relapse, we're surprised. Anybody ever relapse here? Anybody give themselves a hard time for relapsing? As soon as you do that, what you're saying is you don't understand alcoholism. is as soon as you start giving yourself a hard time, what you're saying is you should know better and you have a behavioral problem. But if you have an illness, what's the promise of step one? You're in relapse mode. You're suffering from alcoholism. So when you're talking, if you were to talk to these people that put it together, you're talking from two different points of view. You're talking from a person who's looking for a solution or try to understand a problem that you're suffering from. They're talking from a place of having recovered from a course of action. So they talk about they were powerless over alcohol. They're no longer powerless over alcohol. So if you're doing step one, you'd be saying, I am powerless over alcohol, because you haven't obtained the solution yet. You're still suffering from a problem that they found a solution to. That's why they say in how it works, here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. They have the practical application of putting this in place that allows them to recover from the illness that had them hopelessly defeated before, right? Seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. We understand what that means.
If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely.
So what symptom is that?
Malady.
How many people say the allergy? So we'll read it again slowly. And this is one of the things Chuck taught me how to do, is read the book. Because what I do is I start thinking as I read. Any thinkers here? And I already think I know the answer. Anybody ever do the sheets and have a heck of a time doing them because you're looking for what you think it should say? How many people have gone over the same page about 5 times and realized your answer isn't on there? And then you actually put the answer that was meant to be presented as information, right? So, read that again.
If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely.
So, quit entirely means I've stopped, but I've started again, right? Stopping means, stop entirely means including weekends and holidays. How many people found that surprising? What do you mean, weekends and holidays too? What an order. I can't go through with it. We know. Right? So when you get here, the idea of never drinking again, how many people did that kind of give you a little bit of a panic? Because that's the only solution, regardless of the consequences and the pain and suffering associated with it. Our problem, we think, is the consequences. If I could just drink without consequence, I'll be okay. How many people were hoping to find a way to drink without consequence? Got a smile over there, right? Yeah, identification. It's okay. This is not entrapment, right? So it kind of is, eh? So what happens is that we find that we can't drink with impunity. We can't drink without consequence on a continuous basis. Why is that?
The malady.
Because of the allergy, right? If I have an abnormal reaction to alcohol, I get thirstier when I drink. Anybody like that here? Regardless of what happens to me, I'll go have another drink. Bill talked about that in the story. People were jumping from high places when the stock market went to hell in a handbasket. He would not jump. What did he do? Went back to the bar. How many people had a problem here and took it to the bar?
Oh, yeah.
And if you stay in the bar long enough, your problem will go away. You ever notice that? Unless it's a warrant. That stays continuously, right? Those things don't go away, right? Okay. So it's the malady. It's the condition that they talked about on page 23 is the main problem of the alcoholic that centers in the mind. And then they really elaborated on page 37. They describe it as a phenomena, an unexplainable event that happens with people like us. We try to explain why we relapse, but it's an unexplainable event. It's a malady, a condition that centers in our mind, right? And so what they're saying is, here's pictures what it looks like. And then what you do is go back in your drinking history to see if you exhibit that characteristic. If you exhibit that characteristic, then that means what we'll find out later is you've placed yourself beyond human aid, that you can't trust you to keep you sober, that you're doing an act against your own will. How many people's done an act against their own will here more than a couple times? How many people would pass a lie detector test here that I'm never going to do it again? It's not running from your nose. That position. Anybody been there? You talk loved ones, family, the horrid look on their faces, your kids, and that pit in your stomach, and you would do anything to quit and never do it again. Anybody been there? And then how many people did it again? So now you've moved from a behavioral problem into an illness, right? Now the problem starts. Because if I can't stop myself from starting, I got a real problem now. It didn't mean I can't stay sober for periods of time, which is called abstinence. It's not called sobriety. So a lot of people come into the fellowship and experience abstinence and confuse it for recovery. Right? You will feel better when you stop drinking. Anybody? And then you start feeling a lot worse. Anybody notice the longer you are in between drinks, the worse your mental health gets? And the worse everybody around you gets. Huh? Those people. Anybody have problems with those people? Why are they always picking on me? Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably alcoholic.
So what symptom is that?
The body.
The allergy, and they describe the seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. They've covered those two symptoms in great detail, and they give you pictures of what it looks like. The guy suddenly thought putting an ounce of whiskey in his milk. As he crossed the threshold to the dining room, not a cloud on the horizon, not a problem in the world. So if he did a self-check-in, he would say, "Self, what do you think? I think you're doing good." What would go good with doing good? A couple highballers. And back to the puzzle factory, a treatment center, recovery house, or whatever it is, right? Back, locking myself up for me. Why do we go to halfway houses and treatment centers? It is a modern day asylum. You're looking for protection from who? Yeah, so AA is kind of like witness protection. We're trying to give you a new identity. There's been somebody trying to kill you, and you find it really surprising when it's been you. Oh my God, it's me. Right? So we're going to we'll give you a handler, and you got to check in on a daily basis. As long as you keep this in new identity, you don't have to worry about going back to, right? Okay, that was fun. Okay.
If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer.
So, did they ask you what that means? No. They tell you what that means. And where would you find out what they mean by that? The spiritual appendix in the back of the book. And then they give you an example of that in Bill's story, and they give you two examples of that in a doctor's opinion, and they give you examples of that through the stories of those who became sold on the ideas contained in this book, applied it to their lives, and recovered. Right? So they talk about that. So far in the book, they've talked about the problem, the solution, and the course of action. They just haven't talked about step one. They give you the whole package. So now, if I need a psychic change or spiritual experience, and if I went to you at this time, choose a God of your own understanding, you'd defeat yourself. The book doesn't say that. People read it as that. They start telling new people that. Well, choose God as you understand him. The book doesn't say that. What it says is, we'll explain to you what the solution is. We'll explain to you what we mean by this power greater. We'll explain to you what it means and how to access it. And then you can choose your own conception on what we're talking about. Right? Because we find out lack of power is our dilemma on the next page. And explains what that means is if a better philosophy of living. How many people tried that? Better philosophy, being nicer, going to church, opening the door for people, trying not to trip old people, like being nice. Anybody ever try nice sobriety? Go to the meeting and talk about how spiritual you are as you're at home weaving a rope, You ever notice before you get to a meeting, like you're batshit crazy? Like you're screaming in your own head, like the voices are so loud you got to talk out loud? That's because the energy gets so much that you can't contain it anymore, that you actually got to start talking to yourself to release it. Thank God they have those earpieces now, so everybody looks normal. But before cell phones, this is what us untreated look like in cars. Lips moving, head moving, hands going. People go, what the hell, stay away from that person. Now you see one of you doing that in the car, you think you're talking to somebody, right? Yeah. Anyway, anybody ever been in a room alone and you're having an argument with yourself? And somebody goes, what are you doing? You say, mind your own business. This is personal. So, lack of power, we understand, to create the change necessary to recover from an illness that's killing me. Right? And so they go through here and they say you are governed by belief and energy. But your belief system and where you spend your energy is working toward your demise. So they talk about that on page 54, 55. And there's a lot of different things here because they talk to the atheist and they talk to the true believer and they talk to the agnostic. All three of them have the same problem. Their understanding of things isn't working for them, and it isn't spelling the necessary change necessary to recover. Their belief system is working toward their demise instead of their betterment. So by the time they get here on page 55, they talk about, and you can read it later, we've gone through it in great detail, that we do have a belief system. Where you spend all your energy and your thinking is your belief system. So all day, what you spent thinking about, you believe to be true. And you're acting like it's going to happen, and you're spending your energy or your faith in believing that it's going to happen, and there's nothing happening. How many people spent a lot of time thinking about stuff that's not happening? Mm-hmm. Or thinking about stuff that did happen, and they're trying to make it change. Mm-hmm. Or make them pay again. How many people spend a lot of time in the past here? How many people spend a lot of time in the future? And then how many people spend a lot of time in make-believe? So what you do is you create a euphoric, you think about something strong enough where it creates a euphoric feeling within inside of you and nothing's happening. How many people's daydreamed about spending the lottery here? And get depressed when you don't win. Yeah. So 54, 55, then they talk about, because we understand what they mean by this power and where this power is located, right? And the bare minimum in step 2 is, say, being willing to believe that there is a power greater than myself, and if I do this course of action as laid out by those that went before me, I'll have the same experience. A lot of people say step 2 is about having God. It's not about having God. It's about believing that there is a course of action and a power greater than myself, or even a willingness to be willing that there is this power, and sidestepping all my thinking. So on page 55, they talk about where am I to find this power that they talk about. And this is the essence of what they mean when they talk about God as we understood him. They're all in agreement of the solution. They all agree on where the solution is. Every single one of them agree, and this is the essence of it on page 55. Actually, we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things, but in some form or other it is there. So what is calamity? Noise where? In your own mind. How many people got a lot of calamity going on? They got a full 10-piece band playing. Okay. And you're Mr. Bean trying to sing. Okay. And worship. How many people worship things? Worship means where you spend your energy. So if you looked at where you spent your energy, this is a form of worship, isn't it? Is it constructive or destructive where you spend your time and energy? And based on your thinking, how are you feeling? So are you anxiety-based? Are you fear-based? Are you conflict-based? Are you in constant tension and worry? Do you spend a lot of time absent from the moment? Physically you're here, but emotionally and mentally you're somewhere else. That's forms of worship, of bondage, and all these other things that cripple us. Unless we find a solution to that, how well will we survive sobriety? How many people's relapsed here? Because you didn't find a solution suitable enough for you to be comfortable within your own skin. You haven't found the peace and contentment that they talk about necessary in order to recover. You haven't made peace with you. Anybody would say that's a kind of... Yeah. Okay.
For faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself.
And we see all those demonstrations within the fellowship. How many people heard people's story and then you see where they're at now and you can't believe that they're the same person? It's like remarkable what happens in the fellowship of AA from where people come from and where they end up in the lives they live. What's the common thread between these people is this course of action that's put together so they all have the same experience. Once you do this, you have the same understanding of what the problem is, what the solution is, and the same experience on the course of action. You become a part of the collective. You're no longer a singular experience. And even in your experience is not singular. You find out everybody that went before you had suffered or is still suffering from the thing that you're trying to overcome. Right?
We finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup, just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality deep down within us.
Where? In some of us or all of us?
All of us.
So when they talk about actually we're fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is a fundamental idea of God. This energy, this power, this thing that wants better for you, this thing that talks to you in your darkest hour, this thing that tells you there's a different possibility of a different story for you. How many people's had that voice? How many people's had that thing at your most darkest hour said, hey, and it gave you comfort and it created a shift inside of you where you're able to overcome that moment and seek help, come to a fellowship, come to a meeting. How many people in their darkest hour, something, and you felt the weight of that? You notice in your shoulders are like it's heavy. Anybody been heavy here? And then someone gives you some hope and it kind of just gives you, it lifts you. You ever watch people who are kind of, I don't want to say, who are solution-oriented? They have a different walk about them. They have a different demeanor about them. There's just something different about them. When Bill seen Ebby, what was the first thing Bill noticed about Ebby when he opened the door? There was something different about him. Ebby didn't have to spend half an hour trying to convince Bill that he changed. Anybody spend a lot of time trying to convince people that they changed? I've really changed, honest. Okay, I could see that. Good. You got $20? No. Sorry.
In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found.
So what does that mean in the last analysis?
After thought about it.
After trying everything else. How many people's tried everything else here to change their lives? We have to be pretty mangled in order to commence this way of living. Like, we're not wimps, huh? We're strong-willed people. Like the beating we give ourselves is far worse than anybody's beating they've ever given us. They're amateurs compared to what we can do to ourselves. Anybody? Huh? We're black belts and kicking our ass. Oh, sorry.
It was so with us. We can only clear the ground a bit. If our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself, then, if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway.
So how many people's had that voice? Like when I look back over my life, in my darkest hours, there's something. I remember, I've said this many times, I came to, I don't know, I was at home, I was lying on my back, and the voice just said that it got my attention, don't fall asleep on your back. And I turned over. That's the only thing I remember of that whole week was that one voice. Or sometimes I'd end up in a place that say, leave now. Anybody ever have that voice? Anybody ignore that voice? But you did have it, right? Well, should have listened to myself. How many people's had that now? What? Okay. So what they talk about is clearing the ground to find this entity, this energy, this life force that we already have that enables us to be the human experience, right? So in the fourth step where we're at, they're talking about on page 63. And this is the idea. See, a lot of people, and if you didn't know what they were talking about, it'd make good sense that you could experience step 3 and step 3, and that when you did step 3, you'd have the relationship and the ability to overcome self and all that other stuff, the release of the bondage, that you'd have a new freedom and a new happiness. You're under the illusion that you're able to create surrender in step 3, which you are not. Because if you were able to do that, then would you need to do the rest of the steps? So step 3 is an idea of the ability to accomplish or experience if I carry on with the rest of the steps. It's an idea. So page 62 talks about the human dilemma, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of the human dilemma, right? Page 63 says there's a different experience, and they talk about that at the top of the page. They talk about the people that went through this course of action that have a new experience when they got access to power. Then they say, if you want this experience, we're now at step 3, we're going to show you how to have this experience that we have. And if you were able to have it in step 3, you wouldn't need to do any of the other steps. So when you look at the wording of step 3, page 63.
We are now at step 3. Many of us said to our Maker as we understood him, God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt.
So what's God's will for you at this, or this power, this entity, the purpose of step 3? What is the purpose of where you're at right now in this process? What are you making a decision to do? To move forward, to get access to this power that will create the change. Having had a spiritual awakening is the result of these steps. I need to go through the process in order to experience this. If I was able to experience it in step 3, which a lot of us are under the delusion that we are, that I'm able to turn my will and life over every day without doing the work, is a form of delusion. What's our problem on page 62? We're driven by 100 forms of fear and self-delusion. Who's the only ones that don't think so? Us. And life makes it clear the way we're living isn't working. Full of resentment, conflict, self-pity, impending doom, calamity, full of resentments, harms, fears. Anybody have those bed buddies? Anybody's brain wake up before they do? Let's start again. Oh, we have a treat for you. And that's what they mean by the bondage. You're thinking. How many people have been in a meeting and they just think? Think. How many people are thinking right now?
Oh, yeah.
How many people get a thought and you're locked in the thought? You can't come back to the present. Some people start laughing, then you come back and go, what?
Yeah.
That's what they mean by the bondage and difficulties to overcome these things, to stay present. So these things that what still lying within are still determining how we feel, think, and respond to life. They're all the stuff we carry from our past that they talked about in page 55. Did not these things, after all, determine how we think, feel, and react to life? Right? So we're able to smile at people, and we're stabbing them on the inside when we're thinking, keep talking, oh yeah, I love you. Anybody try to go undetected, but inside you're like, ah! Every Wednesday at 7. So it's kind of like this. Here's the thing. How many people here has shared in a meeting? So if they were to put your thinking on a board as you were sharing, oh yeah, would it be the same? Oh no. Hey, 5 minutes before the meeting, your teeth are grown, you're dragging your knuckles, yeah, you're hating everybody. You show up, it's like, hi. Acceptance, turn it over, surrender. And then somebody doesn't say something you like in a meeting and you lose your shit. Or they say something that you take personal and you carry it for the next 2 hours. Nobody like that here, right? Okay.
Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will.
So there's a process to be relieved of these things that I used to stumble on. There's a different experience. If you get relief from something that you used to have trouble with, are you not now learning to apply a solution where you get a different experience from what you're used to having? Right? So in order to do that, you need to get through the resentment part. You need to get through the inventory, right?
Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. We thought well before taking this step, making sure we were ready.
So we know why we're doing it. We're willing to go to any lengths. We're up against the biggest battle we've ever faced in our lives, ourselves. But we can't do it alone, right? What they're saying is now you're going to get access to this power that you don't understand, that all these members went before you said, just try this thing and start experiencing it for yourself. And when you experience it for yourself, then no explanations necessary after that. It's like anybody ever been on a roller coaster here? So when you explain, like when I went to Wonderland with one of my daughters, I thought she wanted to go on this one roller coaster. I said, they're all the same. Let's just go on this one over here. She says, no, I want to go on this one, Dad. So I'm in the lineup explaining to her that all roller coasters are the same. I haven't got the experience of going on this roller coaster, but I'm talking like I have the experience of going on this roller. I'm comforting her with my profound knowledge of something I haven't done yet. Welcome to an AA meeting. So, right? Come on. You don't have to show hands. We all,
Yeah.
11 years in and out.
Yeah.
So I'm in this lineup. We're in a meeting. It's same thing in the lineup, talking, blah, 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 hoping I can get this experience. I get on this ride. Well, before I was halfway through, I had a new experience. I was screaming louder than my daughter. The veins in my neck were popped up. I mean, I was hoarse. It was nothing. Even talking about it now is like I'm still having that experience. Do I sound excited when I'm talking about that? Because I have the experience of it. You'll be amazed before you're halfway through. When you have the experience of it, it's kind of like, whoa, this is what you're talking about? This is what I've been robbing myself of by not doing this process? So I went, what I found out after is one of the top 10 roller coasters in the world. It was called the Behemoth. You sit on a seat and you can see the ground and the railing, and you strip it, and there's this little thing you hang on like a bicycle. And there's like this. There's nothing. Okay. And then these guys click, 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 click. And that's our thinking process. Click, 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 click. And there you go, everything. And then that's our recovery, right? So, anybody got the click, 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 click? Okay. So they're saying on the next page, they're saying alcohol is but a symptom, and then they give us this idea here. Therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. But backing up, they said the wording was quite optional so long as we express the idea. Step 3 is an idea that I can experience this if I go through the rest of the work. It's an idea that it's possible for me to have the same experience of all those that went before me. These things that are crippling me, these people found an answer to, right? If I'm just willing to go through this. So I call it, I had to redefine this whole thing. So when I started this thing, I got rid of all my religious teachings and background. I come from a charismatic background. So my idea of this religious thing and having a spiritual experience was far different than what people were suggesting, but I didn't know that because somebody said, come up with your own idea. And the idea I had, there was no way I was achieving it before because my family all got together at a charismatic movement and all voted that I was possessed and had a private meeting of the laying on of hands and casting out of demons. So now you say I'm going to go through that again? I'm good. I'm good because of my preconceived ideas. So when I got here, it's like I abandoned all thought and experience that I had. I believed that there was something that they talked about. I was willing to do this course of action. So for me, it was, I don't know who or what you are, but I'm open to this. I need this experience or I'm going to die. I'm open to this. And that was my prayer. I don't know who or what you are. Show me. Show me what these people are talking about. That was my step 3. I'm open. Let's do this thing. Because step 3 here is a contract up at the top of the page. If we perform this work well, meaning if I leave these principles, he'll provide all that I need, not all that I want. That's a contract between me and source, power, God, creation, whatever you want to call it. That's your comfortability. I call it frequency now. Because when I travel at a low frequency, I'm on the Neanderthal instinct-based living. Right? And I'm driven by different ideas. When I'm traveling at a higher frequency, I'm living by spiritual principles and I have a different experience. And that's what they talk about in 11. When I review my day, have I been instinct-based or am I spiritual-based? And I know the difference between the two because I went through the 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Before you go through this experience, you wouldn't know how to tell the difference between the two. Because we're illusionists. Any illusionist here? We based a lot of our lives not on facts at all. Or not partial truths. Because we're the only group of people that don't really want to know the truth. Yes, I do. Good. Last time somebody was telling you the truth about you, when was the last time you talked to them after that? How many people get upset about them trying to tell you stuff about you that you don't want to know?
All the time.
All the time. Pisses you off, don't it? So you're finding out what everybody already knows. It's like alcoholism. This is a weird thing. How many people were surprised that everybody around you already knew you had a problem? How many people knew you had a problem before you knew you had a problem? And then when you knew you had a problem, you realized the problem's been there a long time. And that's what they talk about this process. When you go through with it, everybody around you will know something's happened, and then you'll suddenly realize that God's source, this process, is doing for you what you couldn't do for yourself. You suddenly realize that you've had a new experience as the result of living it. You'll just kind of go, There's something really different about everything, right? So the wording is quite optional. Then they talk about here, I need to learn a new process for processing life. On page, therefore we started upon a personal inventory. We're not going to get in, but that's what they're saying here. It's about a fact-finding, fact-facing process, right? It's to find out the stuff inside of me that's working toward my demise. There's nothing in your story that you don't already know. How many people don't know their story here? How many people stuck to their story? How many people still crippled by their story, haunted, plagued, right? That's what. So you know your story. So it's not the 90% of your story that you know. It's the 10% that caused it that you don't know what it is. So that's why they say we get down to causes and conditions, and then they get down here, and then they said, so we did exactly the same thing with our lives. See that paragraph?
We did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure.
How many people is okay with that? How many people like to hang on to their past so it becomes their future again?
Being convinced that self, manifested in various ways, was what had defeated us, we considered its common manifestation.
So if you look at the common areas, then you'd be able to use that recipe in all the other areas. Right? Once you learn the recipe in these major things, then you could use the same recipe on the smaller things. Does that kind of make sense? You're learning a new recipe. And so it doesn't make sense on what they're talking about. And so anybody ever hear people say, oh, we have a spiritual disease. It's part of alcoholism. They don't read the book. The book doesn't say we have a spiritual disease. How many people just argued a bit in their brain? Because you hear it all the time. It must be true. Everybody says it. Let's see what the book says in regards to spiritual disease. Resentment, our best friend.
Okay. Resentment is the #1 offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else.
Right? So we got that, right? So what are we talking about? We're talking about resentments. Are we not talking about resentments now?
Yeah.
So, from it, right? So they're talking about resentments, right? The common manifestation on things that cripple us, that causes our failure, right?
From it stem all forms of spiritual disease.
From what? From the resentment that's connected to my consciousness. Is the abscess that's created through these resentments, these things that carry, that I'm still poisoning myself with, the things that I can't shake. When I relive them, it brings up all this emotion and it's like I'm still there. It's an abscess on my spirit. My spirit is not sick. What it is carrying all this stuff on it that saves me from the experience of living the way I'm meant to live. From it stems all forms of spiritual disease. From the resentment stems all forms of spiritual disease. That's poisoning my system, is the resentment. Right? Is that what it says? Or okay.
For we have been not only mentally and physically ill,
We've covered that, right?
we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically.
So they use the word malady there. When you look it up, it's not defined by one thing. It's hard to really define it because it exhibits itself in 100 different forms. It's really hard to pinpoint something that's happening at the subconscious level because by the time we get the memo, the thought's already formulated. We'll find that we're already in thought before we don't create the thought's already created and we become a part of something that's already happening. It's like going into a movie theater halfway through the movie. You become aware of what's on the screen, but then you realize you've been there the whole time. The movie's been playing all along. By the time you become aware of it, you're in it. Does that kind of make sense? Mm-hmm. Anybody ever watch a TV show, a commercial comes on and you forget what you're watching? Because you get lost in thought. Anybody say, I'm not going to think about this anymore? And then you're heavy thinking about it. You don't go to yourself, oh, now's a good time to review this. You're in it. That's the bondage and difficulty. That's the abscess, these things that are coming to the surface that you're still carrying. Unless you find a solution for that, you will return to alcohol. Because it's an abscess. Anybody ever have an abscess here? Anybody ever have an infection or a sliver? When it all pusses up, it's a symptom of the sliver. Right? So in order to get rid of the pus, you need to get rid of the sliver. In order to get, this is the same thing. In order to get rid of the pride, you got to get rid of the resentment. It's like a sliver in our soul. It's creating this abscess. And it's been there all along. Anybody carrying shit for years? And that's what they're saying. You can be free of that, right? So they talk about, we made the list on one piece of paper. We added the name here on this piece of paper here. And put the one name, and then we put why we're mad at them all the way down here. We're as defined as the example on page 65, Mr. Brown. So we put Mr. Brown there, hypothetically. And then you see there's 5 or 6 causes. Then we do 5 or 6 causes all the way down the sheet. So if it's dad, mom, or an ex, you probably have 4 sheets on them. You don't write the story, you write something that engages your thought. It's like when I say the guy with the blue cap, does anybody know what I'm talking about? I know what I'm talking about because it brings me back to a time in my life where this created a lot of havoc in my life. Right? This situation with the blue cap. And it may sound kind of weird, but when I made the list, this guy with the blue cap came up, and he's never come up in any other inventory process I've ever done writing my own story out. But when I did this in meditation, you're learning how to meditate. Sit quietly, and your conscience will tell you what you're carrying. So I put the blue cap, and I thought, isn't that weird? Right? So 30 years ago, I put the blue cap down, and what happened when that happened was when I was 6 years old or 7 years old. I was on the way home from school, and I was in a street gang called the Demons in Toronto. I was trying to get home because the older kids would get a hold of me and beat me up, who was in an older gang. So I tried to get home before they get a hold of me. The one guy got a hold of me and was beating me up outside my laneway. The next door neighbor's dog, I was friend with, was an ex-police dog. It jumped the fence and grabbed the kid by the face. They put the dog down. I never thought about it again from that moment. So when the blue cap came up, if I would have disregarded that, I seen I was still carrying this thing that was so deeply buried, but in my meditation it came up. So these stupid ideas, that's stupid, I dealt with this, I don't have resentment. If it comes to mind, you write it down because there's something in your consciousness that's still attached to it. Right? So that was just an example. So we went through this, and then we see what areas are affected. Was it my self-esteem? So on the next page, it talks about here, as the course of action to conclude others were wrong, but it talks about here, it is plain.
It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment
So
leads...
deep resentment, what does that mean? Does that mean you'll be able to home in on it all the time? It's deep. It shows up every once in a while. When you least expect it, it'll show up. The guy with the blue cap, that's deep. A lot of us, anybody have some deep stuff going on here? Anybody ever raised an alcoholic home? Or people abusive situation? We carry deep, we learn to live with that stuff and we bury it. It's buried. We just learn, it just becomes a part of us. We don't give it a second thought. But that stuff's still eating our lunch and determining our relationships with people, places, and things. We're on high alert all the time. Just anybody on high alert? My wife said that. She goes, I like going to conferences, but you people are intense. You always act like something's about to happen any minute. Because it is. She goes, you got an intensity about you guys. I said, really? We call it serenity. Well, I watched this couple. They were going to town in a public venue at Burger King. They were just fighting. Their 2 kids were drawing like nothing was happening, but both of them were watching out of the corner of their eye if their parents were going to make a move on them or not. They're sitting there drawing on high alert like nothing was happening. Just totally desensitized to everything. So you get here, and then now you're going to start dealing with that stuff. And then what happens when it comes up? What do you do when it starts to resurface? What's the exercise? You do the 3rd step prayer and remind yourself what this is about. It's about a fact-finding, fact-facing process. It's not about reliving. It's about separating yourself from the story so you can be an observer of it. But some of it, you still have the emotional ties to it. And the prayer starts cutting the ties to it. Some of it you'll have to carry in your 6, right? And then in 10 and 11. And some of it will take the rest of your life to find peace with it, but you'll be able to deal with it. That's the difference. Before you're not able to deal with it, now you're able to compartmentalize it where it's not eating your lunch. You're able to acknowledge it, revamp the story so you find peace from it and move forward from it. If you don't have this exercise, you won't be able to do that. You'll still be eating your lunch. Does that kind of make sense? And so this is what they're getting, deep resentment.
It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness.
See, I didn't know what that stuff was until I got it all on paper, because I didn't think I had any resentments. I just had a list of people to get even with still. See, all this had to be explained to me. My step 8 was I never did nothing to nobody that didn't have it coming to them. So I was a little warped. I know it's hard to believe looking at me now. Like I was like, really? Like nuts. My sponsors walked me through this slowly and explained what it meant. The resentment was the things you still think about, harbor, these things. I just wrote, he says, write all the people you still need to get even with. Okay. It was a long list. Write all the people that ever harmed you. Okay. And then he says, these are resentments. You refeel, replay it. I went, oh, wow. I didn't know that. It took the process to see what these things meant and how they exhibit themselves in my life as fact-finding, fact-facing process. I see how I start to operate now with the same recipe that we all apply. How I respond to life and these basic instincts will be different than how you respond to life. But it's a response to life. So this is a response about me. Well, it will create high alert in me, may be a relaxing situation for you. But I see how I operate about the truth about the stock and trade. So I'm aware of these things when I get into 10 and mostly in 11. Because when they resurface, I'm able to see, oh, my self-esteem, my spirit, personal, my material, these things are showing up, and it's showing up in my relationship and at work. So I step backwards and see where am I at spiritually with these things. I say, fear is the basis of this. I've been trying to solve it myself and creating myself more problems. So in step 11 it says, it asks what corrective measures can I take? That means when I wake up the next day still having that problem, I approach it differently. I approach it by applying these spiritual principles instead of applying myself on an instinct basis, getting a different result. Right? So the whole magic to this whole thing is actually step 11. Most people don't get past step 10 because our first obsession is fixing ourselves. This is not about working on us. That's stage 1 recovery. You think it's about working on you. It's about getting to stage 2 recovery where you're working on your relationship with something greater than you that fixes your problem.
To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile?
Why do we permit these? Because we have a solution now. Right? That doesn't have to be our story anymore. All that stuff doesn't have to eat our lunch, right?
But with but with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave.
So where we got to last week, we found out that we're always going to have resentments because we're instinct-based people. But we need to learn how to master them, the ones that we're going to accumulate now and the ones that are still eating our lunch. So once you've dealt with this, it's no longer a resentment when you carry it forward. Once you've gone through this process, it's no longer a resentment, it's an attachment in step 6. It's something you're carrying forward. So in step 6, you acknowledge the things that are still carrying forward or still causes you emotional deformities that you're bringing forward, that you apply these solutions to when they arise again. Does that kind of make sense? So on the next page, we talked about these prayers last week, right? So this was our course. Let's start from there. We might go a couple of minutes over, but it's okay. At the bottom of so we're going to learn how to master resentment. They're going to tell you this is how you do it.
This was our course. We realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick.
Instinct-based. They couldn't do it any different if they tried. It wasn't personal, right? You see them differently, the same way we start seeing ourselves. The reason I did those things is because I was spiritually sick. I was driven by resentment, fear, and alcoholism. I couldn't have done it different. It wasn't personal. I didn't make that conscious decision to do those things. I couldn't have done it any different given those circumstances in that moment. Anybody have that life?
Yeah. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too.
So if I start looking at them different like that, I start separating my attachment to them.
We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend.
Where does this happen? Internally, in your thinking. Because a lot of these resentment, you don't see these people, places, and things. So when they resurface themselves, you apply this prayer, you start looking at them differently. And if you show kindness and all, if you practice this within your own thinking, well, your thinking start changing. How many people want to be free? That's what they're saying. I need to be free of these things because these people, I'm either the jailer or the prisoner. In this case, I'm both.
When a person offended, we said to ourselves, "This is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God, save me from being angry. Thy will be done." We avoid retaliation or argument.
Where? Mentally. We're starting to correct it before it becomes a problem. How many people do that exercise now? How many people just make them pay again? How many people do a lot of retaliation and argument in their brain? We already know the truth, right? Get gunned off a bit, right? We're all like this. They're saying, hey, guess what? You're not alone. This is all our dilemma, right? So if we correct the argument and the retaliation in your own thinking, is it going to change your emotional state in the moment? Is it going to change your attachment? Is it going to change your anxiety level? Is it going to change your experience with people, places, and things in the moment? Will you be more receptive to the people around you? When you're in a resentment and you're experiencing these harms or these angst or these resentments, how personable are you? Anybody ever been in a resentment? Ask their friend, what?
Yeah.
Whoa, sorry. Okay.
We avoid retaliation or argument. We wouldn't treat sick people that way. If we do, we destroy our chance of being helpful. We cannot be helpful to all people, but at least God will show us how to take a kindly and tolerant view of each and every one. Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done.
This is the fourth column now.
We resolutely looked for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened?
So we see, when we entirely look at it from a different angle, it's because of my selfishness, my inconsideration, dishonesty, and fear that have these people in my life, or this situation reoccurring based on one of my instincts. Because of my self-esteem, I was self-seeking. And I sought this person who wasn't good for me, but they did something for me. I stayed in a job that was abusive because I was afraid of my material or emotional. I stayed in this relationship because I couldn't afford to rent myself. Anybody got those things? So we see 90% of the stuff that's happening in my life I've created based on one of my instincts running amok. It's like with Kim. Kim was on there. Before I went out with Kim, everybody told me what Kim was like. But I thought she wouldn't be like that with me. Because I'll be able to change her. Yeah. And then when she was like that with me, I was really sore. But who put myself in that situation? Me, because it built my self-esteem, my security. I got something from the relationship, even though it was working toward my demise. Stayed with her 7 years. Most of my scars are from her. We loved each other. I haven't found that kind of love since. Thank you, Jesus. Okay.
Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight.
So, on the end of the page here, are we willing to set these matters straight? Where are they talking about?
Step 9.
Step 9? How many people say step 9? How many people say within inside your own self? Yeah. You change the story. You're willing to look at it differently. And as you become spiritually fit through doing these exercises, so now we got 2 prayers. We got the third step prayers for me. We got the resentment prayers, my attachment to people, places, and things. Right? So I'm applying one of these 2 things when my past starts to resurface or I get attachment to these things, and I'm willing to look at it differently. So even though the situation had not been entirely our fault, a lot of us will go right away to situations that weren't our fault. We get stuck there. Anybody? What they're saying is that with my stepfather, he was one of the meanest people I ever met in my life ever since. He escaped from the Second World War. He was just under the SS. He was an atheist, and he was one of the meanest people I ever met. The stories in the life and the things that he did was unbelievable. He used to beat me within an inch of my life. The guy was just brutal. So it was hard to find out where, but I was antagonistic. I'd drop a record player on his head. I'd put insulation in his bed. I would just make him pay, right? Pee in his coffee. I mean, I was a kid. Make you pay. So I got a sick satisfaction that I was getting the better of you, right? So I'd antagonize. So even though, no, I'm not saying because I looked at him differently when I learned all those things about it. I seen why he was the way he was, and then I had to look honestly how I was. I was a nightmare at school. I was an embarrassment to my family. I was in the street, like on and on and on. The things I was doing, burned the neighbor's garage down. Like the police were showing up all the time. So I could see what he was trying to correct me, but I took that personal. And it went to an extreme because he was not right in his head. And he was the guy that I had to start. It was really weird. He was the guy when I was probably 4, and he sat me on a porch in Toronto, and there was a lightning storm, like no rain, like an electrical storm, like you've never seen lighting up the whole sky and cracking. And I'm just horrified. And he's looking at me and he says, you know what that is, you little bastard? He says, God's mad at you. That's why this is happening. I went upstairs under my bed and I was begging God not to be mad at me. So every time there was a lightning storm, I'd get that feeling of guilt that God was mad. Like, beep, 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 beep. Like, find a God of your understanding? I don't think so. I don't think so. But the willingness to do this process started getting me connected to Source. I started getting freedom from my past. It's like, I don't know why this thing works when I apply this prayer and the willingness to do something that don't make sense. I started getting relief. And I started correcting these things, and I started getting relief from it. I started mastering resentment. I started having a new experience by accessing Source, which is this entity or this thing deep down within me. So when I got disturbed, I learned how to go quiet and go back to that place. I don't know who or what you are. I need some help. And I'd get relief. Or I'd go to a meeting, and somebody would just home in on me. Like God, the fellowship of the Spirit is, as God's people, we know each other on a different level than what we see. You ever see some people and you just know all about them and you just connect with them and you help them walk from the place that they couldn't get out on their own? That's what this whole thing is about, and this is a start of. So you're not going through your fourth alone. You're accessing this power, right? You're looking at it on a spiritual basis to get freedom from this thing. It works. It didn't say you have to understand it. It says try it. You should have a sponsor. You should have somebody who's familiar with the book, and just try it and see if you get any relief. And next week we'll have even more fun.
Tony.
So what's the key ingredient to longevity?
God,
grant me the serenity
to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
We have the worksheets back there if you want to get caught up, and next week we'll do some revising.